I was 57 when my daughter-in-law, Claire, looked me dead in the eye and said, "No one wants old women in photos." Her words sliced through me like a blade, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed every silent judgment I'd faced for decades. I stood there in my own living room, holding a family album I'd spent years curating, my fingers trembling against the leather cover. The room smelled of the lavender candles I'd lit to make the evening feel warm, but all I felt was cold. Claire's lips curled into a half smile, the kind that says she's already won, and my son, David, just sat there staring at his phone, pretending he hadn't heard. I wanted to scream, to fling the album at her, to demand why my existence was suddenly an inconvenience. But I didn't. I swallowed the hurt, like I always had, and let it settle deep in my chest, where it joined the other wounds I'd carried since I was a girl. My name is Eleanor Marie Thompson, and I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what it's like to be erased. Not just from a photo, but from your own life. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where the air always smelled of rain and rust, and the world had a way of telling women like me to stay small. My father was a mechanic, hands always stained with grease, and my mother was a seamstress who stitched dreams into other people's wedding dresses, but never dared to dream for herself. They loved me, in their way, but love came with rules. "Don't be too loud, Ellie," my mother would say, her voice soft but firm. "Men don't marry women who talk too much." By the time I was 12, I'd learned to shrink myself, my voice, my ambitions, my very presence. I was good at it, too good. I was 16 when I first felt the sting of being unwanted. My high school held an art contest, and I'd spent months on a painting. A woman standing in a field, her face half-shadowed, her eyes fierce with something I couldn't yet name. I poured everything into it, every quiet rebellion I'd never voiced. When the winners were announced, my name wasn't called. Later, I overheard my art teacher, Mr. Grayson, talking to another teacher in the hallway. "Eleanor's work is intense," he said, his voice low. "But it's not what people want to see. Too much emotion, too much her." I stood there, hidden behind the lockers, my heart pounding. I didn't cry until I got home, locking myself in my room, tearing the painting into pieces. That was the first time I understood that being myself was a risk. I carried that lesson into my 20s when I married Richard, a man who promised stability but delivered control. He was a banker, always in crisp suits, always reminding me that my job was to make his life easier. I wanted to go to college to study literature or maybe even art again, but Richard laughed at the idea. "What's the point, Ellie? You're not that kind of woman." I believed him. I stopped reading novels because they made me want too much. I stopped sketching because it felt like stealing time from him. We had David when I was 25, and for a while, motherhood filled the holes Richard's words had carved. David was my light, curly-haired, wide-eyed, always asking me to tell him stories. I'd make them up as we sat on the porch, fireflies blinking in the dusk, and for those moments, I felt like I was enough. But Richard's patience for me waned as I aged. By the time I was 40, he'd started staying late at the bank, coming home with the scent of perfume on his collar. I didn't confront him. I was too afraid of what it would mean to admit I wasn't enough for him anymore. When David was 15, Richard left us for a woman named Linda, who was 10 years younger and, in his words, full of life. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the divorce papers, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read them. David was upstairs, blasting music to drown out the silence of his father's absence. I didn't cry in front of him. I couldn't. I had to be strong, even if I felt like I was crumbling. The years after that were a blur of survival. I worked as a receptionist at a dental office, answering phones with a smile I didn't feel, coming home to a house that felt too big for just me and David. He grew distant, as teenagers do, and I let him. I thought it was what he needed. When he went to college, I was proud but terrified. Proud because he was chasing a future I'd never had. Terrified because I was alone. I filled my days with small rituals, brewing tea, tending to my garden, flipping through the family album I'd started when David was born. That album was my anchor, proof that I'd built something lasting, even if the world didn't see it. Every photo told a story. David's first steps, our camping trips, the time I sewed him a superhero costume for Halloween. I'd sit on the couch, tracing the edges of those pictures, and for a moment, I could pretend I wasn't invisible. When David met Claire, I thought she was a gift. She was bright, ambitious, a marketing executive with a laugh that filled the room. I welcomed her, cooked her favorite meals, listened to her stories about her career. I wanted to be the mother-in-law she could trust, the one she'd turn to. But Claire had a way of looking through me, like I was a piece of furniture she hadn't decided to keep or toss. She'd interrupt me mid-sentence, change the subject when I spoke about my life. David didn't notice. He was in love, and I didn't want to dim that light. When they got married, I gave them my mother's pearl necklace as a gift, hoping it would mean something. Claire wore it once, then tucked it away. "It's a bit old-fashioned," she said, and I smiled, pretending it didn't hurt. The night Claire said those words about old women in photos, something in me broke. It wasn't just her. It was every moment that had led to it. My mother's warnings, my teacher's dismissal, Richard's betrayal, the world's quiet insistence that I was too much and not enough all at once. I stood there, the album heavy in my hands, and I saw my life in flashes. The girl who stopped painting, the wife who stopped dreaming, the mother who stopped asking for anything. Claire's words weren't new, they were just louder. And David, my David, didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. I felt like a ghost in my own home, haunting a life I'd built but no longer belonged to. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, the album open in front of me, staring at a photo of me and David at the beach when he was 6. I was laughing, my hair wild in the wind, and he was clinging to my hand, smiling like I was his whole world. I touched the photo, my fingers leaving smudges on the plastic sleeve. I wanted to go back to that moment, to be that woman again. But she was gone, buried under years of compromises and silences. I thought about the will I'd written a few years ago, leaving everything to David, the house, the savings, the pearl necklace. It was my way of saying I loved him, even if he didn't see me anymore. But as I sat there, the weight of Claire's words pressing against me, I felt something shift. I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the backyard where I kept a small fire pit for summer barbecues. I carried the album with me, its weight like a stone in my arms. The air was crisp, the grass damp with dew, and my hands shook as I opened the album one last time. I looked at the photos, each one a piece of me, and I whispered, "I'm sorry." Then I tore out the first page and dropped it into the fire pit. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges of the paper, turning my memories to ash. I tore out another page, then another, until the album was empty. I didn't cry. I felt alive, like I was burning away the parts of me that had learned to be small. When the fire died down, I went inside and found the will. I held it over the sink, struck a match, and watched it burn. The smoke stung my eyes, but I didn't look away. I was done being invisible. That was the moment I decided to rewrite my story. Not for David, not for Claire, not for anyone but me. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew it would be mine. I'd spent my life believing I was too old, too broken, too much. But as the ashes of the album and the will settled in the fire pit, I realized something. I wasn't done, not yet, and maybe, just maybe, I never would be. The days after I burned the album and the will felt like waking up in a stranger's body. I'd look in the mirror, expecting to see the same tired lines on my face, the same defeated slump in my shoulders, but there was something new. A spark, faint but stubborn, like a candle refusing to go out. I didn't know what to do with it at first. For so long, my life had been a series of tasks. Go to work, pay the bills, call David to check in, pretend I didn't notice Claire's sighs when I spoke. But now, with the ashes of my past still lingering in the fire pit, I felt untethered. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you might not fall. I started small. The dental office where I worked was a beige prison of routine, the kind of place where dreams went to die quietly. I'd been there for 15 years, answering phones, scheduling cleanings, smiling at patients who barely looked at me. My boss, Dr. Harmon, was a kind man but oblivious, the sort who'd ask me to stay late without noticing I had a life outside his office. I'd always said yes, but the Monday after the fire, when he asked me to cover an extra shift, I heard myself say, no. The word slipped out before I could stop it, sharp and clear. Dr. Harmon blinked, his pen frozen over his clipboard. Eleanor, are you feeling okay? He asked, like I'd spoken in tongues. I nodded, my heart pounding. I can't today. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I walked back to my desk, my hands trembling, but my chest felt lighter, like I'd shed a layer of something heavy. That no was a crack in the dam. Once it started, I couldn't stop. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, for needing things. At the grocery store, when a man cut in front of me in line, I cleared my throat and said, "Excuse me, I was here first." His eyes widened, but he stepped back. At home, I stopped answering David's calls when I knew Claire would be listening in, her voice always ready to correct or dismiss me. I wasn't ready to talk to him yet. I wasn't sure what I'd say or if he'd even hear me. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for protecting myself. I was learning to be selfish, and it felt like breathing after years underwater. It was around then that I met Ruth. She came into the dental office for a cleaning, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled into a messy bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She wore a bright red scarf, the kind of bold choice I'd always admired but never dared to make. While I checked her in, she leaned across the counter and said, "You've got a story, don't you?" Her voice was warm, like she already knew me. I laughed, caught off guard, and mumbled something about being boring. She shook her head. "No one's boring, sweetheart. Not if you're still here." I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled and handed her the paperwork. But her words stuck, like a song I couldn't stop humming. Ruth started coming in regularly, not for her teeth, but for me. She'd book appointments she didn't need just to sit in the waiting room and talk. She'd tell me about her life, how she'd been a nurse for 40 years, how she'd raised 3 kids alone after her husband left, how she'd started painting in her 50s and now sold her work at local galleries. "I was 52 when I picked up a brush again," she said one day, her eyes crinkling. "Thought I was too old. Turns out the world doesn't get to decide that." I listened, hungry for her stories, for the way she talked about herself like she was the hero of her own life. I'd never known anyone like that. Not my mother, not my friends, not even me. One afternoon, Ruth caught me staring at a blank notepad on my desk. I'd been doodling absent-mindedly, sketching the outline of a woman's face, her eyes fierce like the painting I'd made in high school. I tried to cover it, embarrassed, but Ruth grabbed my hand. "Don't hide that," she said. "That's you, isn't it?" I shook my head, but she wouldn't let it go. "Eleanor, you've got something to say. Stop swallowing it." Her words hit me like a slap, not cruel, but urgent. I wanted to argue, to tell her I was just a receptionist, a mother, a woman past her prime, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew she was right. That night, I went home and dug through the attic until I found an old sketchbook, its pages yellowed but empty. I hadn't drawn in years, not since Richard told me it was a waste of time. My hands felt clumsy, the pencil foreign, but I started anyway. I drew the woman from my doodle, her face sharper now, her eyes burning with something I recognized: anger, grief, defiance. I drew until my fingers ached, until the sky outside turned pink with dawn. When I looked at the page, I saw myself. Not the Eleanor who smiled at patients or cooked for Claire, but the one who'd burned the album, who'd said no to Dr. Harmon, who was still here, still fighting. Ruth became my lifeline. She'd show up at the office with coffee, dragging me to the break room to talk about art, books, life. She told me about a community art class she taught at the local library, a free program for anyone who wanted to try. You should come, she said, her tone leaving no room for excuses. I hesitated. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers, exposing my drawings, made my stomach twist. But Ruth had a way of making you believe in yourself, even when you didn't. You're not too old, Eleanor, she said, and you're not too broken. You're just starting. So I went. The first class was terrifying. The library smelled of old books and lemon polish, and the room was filled with people younger than me. College students, young professionals, a few mothers with toddlers in tow. I felt out of place, my sketchbook clutched to my chest like a shield. But Ruth was there, her red scarf a beacon guiding me to a seat. She handed me a canvas and said, "Paint what you feel." I stared at the blank surface, my mind racing. What did I feel? Hurt, betrayal, hope. I dipped my brush in red, the color of Ruth's scarf, and started. I didn't know what I was doing, but I let my hand move, let the colors bleed into each other. When I stepped back, I saw a woman standing in flames, her face half hidden, her eyes alive. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The other students noticed. A girl named Mia, barely 20 with purple hair and a nose ring, leaned over and said, "That's powerful." I blushed, ready to deflect, but she kept going. It's like, she's been through hell, but she's still standing. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, but her words stayed with me. For the first time, I felt seen. Not as David's mother, or Richard's ex-wife, or Claire's inconvenience, but as Eleanor, the woman who'd painted her pain and made it beautiful. I went to every class after that. Ruth pushed me to experiment, to take risks. I painted women, always women, some broken, some fierce, some both. Each one felt like a piece of me, a story I'd never told. I started staying late at the library, losing myself in the work, the world falling away until it was just me and the canvas. At home, I cleared out the guest room and turned it into a studio, covering the walls with sketches and paintings. The house felt alive again, like it was breathing with me. I stopped checking my phone for David's calls. I stopped waiting for Claire's approval. I was building something new, something that didn't depend on them. But the hurt didn't vanish. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd think about David, about the boy who'd held my hand at the beach, and I'd ache for him. I'd think about Claire's words, about the album I'd burned, and I'd wonder if I'd gone too far. I'd sit in my studio staring at my paintings and feel the weight of everything I'd lost, but then I'd pick up a brush and the weight would lift, just enough to keep going. Ruth was right. I had a story, and I wasn't done telling it. The art classes became my sanctuary, a place where the world's judgments couldn't reach me. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I'd walk into the library, my sketchbook under my arm, and feel the knot in my chest loosen. The room was always warm, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the soft scratch of pencils on paper. Ruth would be there, her red scarf draped over a chair, her laughter cutting through the air like sunlight. She had a way of making everyone feel like they belonged, but with me, it was different. She saw the parts of me I'd hidden for years, the anger, the grief, the hunger for something more. "You're not just painting, Eleanor," she'd say, her eyes sharp. "You're claiming yourself." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I felt it, like a pulse beneath my skin, growing stronger with every stroke of my brush. I started to recognize the other students, their faces becoming familiar, their stories seeping into mine. There was Mia, the purple-haired girl who'd called my painting powerful, who drew dark, swirling comics about her struggles with anxiety. There was Javier, a quiet man in his 30s who painted landscapes so vivid they made you feel the wind. And there was Sarah, a single mother who sketched her daughter's face over and over, each drawing a prayer for a better future. We didn't talk much at first, but we shared something deeper, a silent understanding that we were all here to mend something broken. I'd catch Mia glancing at my canvas, her eyes wide with curiosity, and I'd smile, no longer afraid to be seen. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something, not just a shadow in someone else's story, but the classes weren't enough to quiet the ache that came at night. When I was alone in my house, the silence was loud, filled with memories I couldn't burn away. I'd sit in my studio surrounded by my paintings and think about David. I hadn't spoken to him since the night Claire said those words, nearly 3 months ago. He'd called a few times, left voicemails that were polite but distant, asking how I was, saying we should catch up. I didn't call back. I wasn't ready to hear his voice, to feel the weight of his silence when I tried to explain how much Claire's words had hurt. I wasn't ready to face the possibility that he didn't care. So I let the calls go unanswered, let the distance between us grow, and told myself it was for the best. But it hurt, like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the dental office, I came home to find a letter slipped under my door. The handwriting was David's, neat and slanted, just like when he'd write me notes as a boy. My hands shook as I opened it. "Mom," it read, "I know things have been weird. Claire didn't mean what she said. Can we talk? I miss you." The words were simple, but they hit me like a wave, pulling me under. I sat on the couch, the letter crumpled in my fist, and cried for the first time since I'd burned the album. I cried for the boy who'd needed me, for the man who didn't seem to see me, for the mother I'd tried to be. But mostly I cried for myself, for the years I'd spent believing I had to earn his love, or anyone's. I didn't call him that night. I couldn't. Instead, I went to my studio and painted. I didn't plan it, didn't sketch first like Ruth taught us. I just grabbed a canvas and let the colors pour out. Deep blues, angry reds, slashes of black. When I finished, I saw a woman drowning in a storm, her hands reaching for something just out of reach. It was me, but it was also every woman I'd ever known. My mother, stitching dresses for brides she'd never be. Sarah sketching her daughter's face. Even Claire, maybe, hiding her own fears behind sharp words. I stared at the painting until my eyes burned, and I realized something. I wasn't just grieving David. I was grieving the version of myself who'd believed she wasn't enough. The next class, I brought the painting with me. I hadn't planned to show it. It felt too raw, too exposed. But Ruth had a way of coaxing things out of you. She saw me hesitating, my canvas half hidden behind another, and said, "Eleanor, don't hold back. We're here for it all." So I set it up on an easel, my heart pounding as the others gathered around. Mia gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Javier nodded, his eyes tracing the lines. Sarah just stared, her own grief mirrored in mine. "That's real," Mia finally said, her voice soft, like I feel it. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, but their words wrapped around me like a blanket. I wasn't invisible here. I was real. Ruth pulled me aside after class, her hands warm on my shoulders. "You're ready for more," she said, her voice firm but kind. "There's an art show at the community center next month. Local artists, no judges, just people sharing their work. You should submit." I laughed, the idea absurd. "Ruth, I'm not an artist. I'm just a me." She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And who do you think artists are? They're just people who decide to show up. You're already doing that." I wanted to argue, to tell her I wasn't ready, that my paintings were too messy, too personal, but her belief in me was like a current pulling me forward. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll try." The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. I spent every free moment in my studio, painting, sketching, refining. I chose 3 pieces for the show: the woman in flames from my first class, the drowning woman from the night I got David's letter, and a new one, a woman standing on a cliff, her back to the viewer, her arms outstretched like she was about to fly. Each one felt like a chapter of my life, a piece of the story I was finally telling. Ruth helped me frame them, her hands steady as she adjusted the corners. "These are going to stop people in their tracks," she said, and for once I didn't deflect. I believed her. But the closer the show got, the heavier David's letter felt. I tucked it into a drawer, unable to throw it away but unwilling to read it again. I wanted to call him, to tell him about the show, to ask him to come. But every time I picked up the phone, I saw Claire's face, heard her voice saying, "No one wants old women in photos." I saw David's silence, his eyes fixed on his phone. I couldn't bear the thought of inviting him only to be met with indifference, or worse, pity, so I didn't call. I told myself I didn't need him there. I had Ruth, Mia, Javier, Sarah. I had my paintings. I had myself. The night before the show, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my studio staring at the woman on the cliff, her arms wide, her future unwritten. I thought about my mother, who'd never dared to dream. I thought about Richard, who'd left me for someone full of life. I thought about Claire, who'd tried to erase me. And I thought about David, the boy I'd loved with every piece of me, the man I didn't know how to reach. I wanted to be angry, to hold on to the fire that had made me burn the album and the will. But all I felt was a deep, aching sadness. Not just for them, but for the years I'd spent believing I deserved their dismissal. I got up and pulled David's letter from the drawer. I read it again, tracing his handwriting with my finger. "I miss you," he'd written. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there was still a way back to the boy who'd held my hand at the beach, but I wasn't sure I could trust it. Not yet. I folded the letter and slipped it into my purse, a small act of hope I wasn't ready to name. Then I went to bed, the woman on the cliff watching over me, her arms open to whatever came next. The morning of the art show dawned gray and heavy, the kind of day that feels like it's holding its breath. I woke with a knot in my stomach, my hands clumsy as I brewed coffee and tried to steady myself. The community center was only a 10-minute drive, but it felt like a journey to another world, one where I wasn't just Eleanor the receptionist, the mother, the ex-wife, but Eleanor the artist. The words still felt foreign, like a dress that didn't quite fit, but Ruth's voice echoed in my head. Artists are just people who decide to show up. I'd shown up. Now I had to keep going. I arrived early, my 3 paintings wrapped in old bed sheets to protect them. The community center was a low brick building, its walls covered in flyers for book clubs and yoga classes. Inside, the air smelled of fresh paint and coffee, and the main hall was already buzzing with artists setting up their displays. There were sculptures made of wire, abstract collages, photographs of faces and landscapes. I felt small, out of place, my canvases heavy in my arms. But Ruth was there, her red scarf a beacon, waving me over to a corner she'd reserved for me. "This is your spot," she said, her smile wide. "Make it yours." Setting up was both terrifying and exhilarating. I hung my paintings with Ruth's help, adjusting them until they caught the light just right. The woman in flames glowed, her eyes fierce and unyielding. The drowning woman shimmered, her hands reaching through the storm. And the woman on the cliff stood tall, her silhouette sharp against the sky. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and for the first time, I saw them not as pieces of myself, but as art. Real, tangible, worthy of being seen. Ruth squeezed my shoulder. "You did this, Eleanor. You." I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and let the moment sink in. The show opened at noon, and people trickled in. Locals, artists, curious passers-by. I stood by my paintings, my hands clasped to keep them from shaking, and watched as strangers paused to look. Some just glanced and moved on, but others lingered, their eyes tracing the lines of my work. A woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and a scarf not unlike Ruth's, stood in front of the drowning woman for a long time. "This feels like me," she whispered, almost to herself. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, but her words wrapped around me like a hug. I wasn't alone. My pain, my story, was theirs too. Mia, Javier, and Sarah came, their presence a lifeline. Mia brought her sketchbook, doodling as she chatted with visitors. Javier hung his landscapes nearby, their colors warm and grounding. Sarah brought her daughter, a shy girl who clung to her hand but stared at my paintings with wide eyes. "She's strong," Sarah said, pointing to the woman on the cliff. "Like you." I blushed, deflecting with a laugh, but her words stayed with me, stitching something back together inside me. As the day went on, I started to relax. I talked to people, really talked, not just the polite small talk I'd mastered at the dental office. I told them about the paintings, about the women I'd created, about the emotions that had poured out of me. I didn't mention David or Claire or the album I'd burned, but they were there, woven into every brushstroke. People listened, they nodded, they shared their own stories, a lost job, a broken marriage, a dream they'd buried. I realized something. My paintings weren't just mine anymore. They were a mirror, a bridge, a conversation. By late afternoon, the hall was crowded, the air thick with voices and laughter. I was talking to a young artist about color theory when I heard my name. Eleanor. The voice was familiar, hesitant, and it cut through the noise like a knife. I turned, and there was David standing a few feet away, his hands shoved in his pockets. My heart stopped. He looked older than I remembered, his eyes shadowed, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. I hadn't seen him in months, hadn't answered his calls, hadn't told him about the show. Yet here he was, in my world, looking at me like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I froze, my voice caught in my throat. Ruth was beside me in an instant, her hand on my arm, steadying me. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. David took a step closer, his eyes flicking to my paintings, then back to me. I didn't know you did this," he said, his voice low. "They're incredible." The compliment stung more than it soothed, because it reminded me of all the years he hadn't noticed me, hadn't asked. I wanted to ask how he'd found me, why he was here, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I said, "Thank you." My voice flat and turned back to the artist I'd been talking to, pretending I wasn't shaking. David didn't leave. He lingered, moving through the crowd, stopping to look at my paintings again. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Not yet. The show was my space, my victory, and I wasn't ready to let him in. Ruth stayed close, her presence a shield, and Mia, sensing the tension, started telling me a loud, animated story about her latest comic, pulling me back into the moment. I laughed, grateful for the distraction, and let myself sink back into the show, into the people who saw me, who valued me. When the show ended, my paintings had sold, all 3 of them. The woman in flames went to the tired-eyed woman who hugged me before she left. The drowning woman was bought by a local gallery owner who said it spoke to the soul. And the woman on the cliff went to an older man who said it reminded him of his late wife. I stood there stunned as Ruth handed me the checks, her grin wide enough to light the room. "You're an artist now, Eleanor," she said, "no going back." I laughed, tears prickling my eyes, and hugged her, feeling like I'd crossed a threshold I hadn't even known was there. David was still there as we packed up. He helped Javier carry a table to the storage room, his movements quiet, deliberate. I watched him from the corner of my eye, my heart a tangle of anger and longing. When the hall was nearly empty, he approached me again, his hands empty now, his face uncertain. "Mom," he said, and the word hit me like a wave. "Can we talk? Please?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy I'd loved, the man I didn't know, the son I wasn't sure I could trust. I wanted to say yes, to fall into his arms and pretend nothing had changed, but I also wanted to protect this new version of myself, the one who'd painted, who'd sold, who'd been seen. "Not tonight," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "I need time." His face fell, but he nodded, his eyes bright with something I couldn't read. Guilt, maybe, or regret. "Okay," he said. "I'll wait." He turned to leave, and I watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him. Ruth was beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "You did good," she said, and I knew she wasn't just talking about the show. That night, I went home and sat in my studio, the checks from the sales on the table, David's letter beside them. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I'd seen him, heard him, and for now, that was enough. I picked up a brush and started a new painting. A woman walking through a field, her head high, her path her own. I painted until dawn, the world quiet except for the sound of my breath, the scratch of bristles on canvas. I was winning, not just the show, not just the sales, but myself. And that was worth more than any apology, any reconciliation, any past I'd burned away. The weeks after the art show felt like I was living in a new skin. The checks from the sales sat in a drawer untouched, not because I didn't need the money, but because they felt sacred, like proof of something I was still learning to believe. I'd sold my paintings, my stories, my pain, my defiance, and people had wanted them, had seen value in them. It was a quiet revolution, one that unfolded in the soft light of my studio, in the way I carried myself at the dental office, in the way I stopped shrinking when someone looked at me too long. I was becoming someone new, or maybe I was becoming the woman I'd always been, buried under years of silence and compromise. I kept going to Ruth's art classes, but now I wasn't just a student. I was a contributor, someone whose work the others looked to for inspiration. Mia started calling me the Fire Lady because of my first painting, and the nickname stuck, making me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. Javier asked me to help him mix colors for a new piece, his quiet trust a gift I didn't take lightly. Sarah brought me a sketch she'd done of me, my face soft but strong, and I nearly cried when she gave it to me. "You're like a mom to us," she said, her voice shy, and I hugged her, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. I'd lost so much with David, but here, in this makeshift family of artists, I was finding something else. Connection, purpose, a place where I belonged. Ruth pushed me harder now, sensing the shift in me. "You've got momentum, Eleanor," she said one evening, her red scarf trailing as she paced the library room. "Don't stop. The gallery owner who bought your painting? She's been asking about you, wants to see more." I blinked, stunned. The idea of a gallery showing my work felt like a dream too big to touch. "I'm not ready," I said, my old instincts kicking in. Ruth snorted, unimpressed. "Ready's a myth, you're doing it anyway." She handed me a flyer for a regional art exhibition, a juried event with artists from across the state. "Submit 3 pieces, deadlines in 2 weeks." I took the flyer, my hands trembling, not with fear but with something else. Excitement, maybe, or hunger. I threw myself into the work. My studio became a universe of its own, paint splattered and alive, the walls covered with new canvases. I painted women again, always women, but they were different now. Less broken, more powerful. One was a woman weaving stars into her hair, her eyes glowing with secrets. Another was a woman carving her name into a mountain, her hands steady, her face fierce. The third was a woman dancing in a storm, her body fluid, her smile defiant. Each one felt like a promise to myself, a vow that I wouldn't go back to being small. I worked late into the nights, losing track of time, my body tired but my heart full. For the first time, I wasn't painting to heal. I was painting to claim. The dental office started to feel like a cage. I'd sit at my desk, answering phones, scheduling appointments, and feel the pull of my studio, the canvases waiting for me. Dr. Harmon noticed the change, the way I'd sketch on notepads between calls, the way I'd say no to extra shifts without hesitation. "You seem different, Eleanor," he said one day, his tone curious but cautious. I smiled, not the polite smile I'd perfected over the years, but a real one. "I am," I said, and left it at that. I started looking at job listings in my spare time, not because I had a plan, but because I was starting to believe I could have one. Maybe I'd teach art, like Ruth. Maybe I'd sell my work online. Maybe I'd do something I couldn't even imagine yet. The possibilities felt endless, and that alone was a victory. David's letter stayed in my purse, a quiet weight I carried everywhere. I hadn't called him since the art show, hadn't answered the 2 voicemails he'd left after. "Mom, I'm sorry," he'd said in one, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how much you were doing. Can we talk?" I listened to it over and over, my finger hovering over the call button, but I couldn't press it. I wanted to forgive him, to bridge the gap between us, but I was still raw, still guarding the fragile new self I was building. Claire's words echoed in my mind, not as loud as before, but still there, a reminder of the erasure I'd fought so hard to overcome. I needed time, and for once I was giving it to myself. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from the gallery owner, a woman named Vanessa with a voice like warm honey. "Eleanor, I've been hearing about you," she said, and I could hear her smile through the phone. "Your painting's been getting attention. People want to know who you are." She invited me to meet at her gallery, a small but respected space downtown, to discuss a potential solo show. I nearly dropped the phone. A solo show. Me. I stammered a yes, my heart racing, and hung up feeling like I was floating. When I told Ruth, she whooped so loud the other students laughed. "That's my girl," she said, pulling me into a hug. "You're not just showing up now, you're shining." The meeting with Vanessa was a turning point. Her gallery was a bright, airy space, the walls lined with bold abstracts and delicate watercolors. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded attention. She'd hung my drowning woman painting in a prominent spot, and it looked different here, under professional lighting, like it belonged. "This piece stops people," she said, gesturing to it. "It's raw, but it's universal. I want more of that." We talked for hours about my process, my inspirations, my life. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, not even Ruth, about the album I'd burned, the will, the years I'd felt invisible. She listened, not with pity, but with respect. "You're not just an artist," she said as we wrapped up. "You're a storyteller, and people need your stories." Vanessa gave me a deadline, 6 months to prepare for a solo show, 10 to 12 pieces, all new. It was daunting, but I said yes without hesitation. I was done doubting myself. When I left the gallery, the city felt different, brighter, louder, mine. I walked past shops and cafes, my reflection flickering in the windows, and for the first time, I liked what I saw. Not just my face, but the woman I was becoming. Someone who said yes to herself, who took risks, who didn't need permission to exist. That night, I started planning. I sketched ideas, made lists of supplies, calculated how many hours I could carve out around work. I quit the dental office a week later. It wasn't impulsive, it was necessary. I gave Dr. Harmon 2 weeks' notice, and when he asked why, I told him the truth. "I'm an artist. I need to do this." He looked surprised but nodded, and on my last day, he gave me a card with a note. "Go shine, Eleanor." I kept it, a small token of a life I was leaving behind. I took a part-time job at a local bookstore to cover bills, a quiet place that smelled of paper and possibility. The work was simple, shelving books, ringing up customers, but it gave me time to think, to dream. I jot down ideas on scraps of paper, inspired by the novels I shelved, the customers who shared their stories. My studio became my home, my paintings my language. I was building a world where I was enough, where my voice mattered, where my worth didn't depend on anyone else's validation. But David was still there, a shadow in the corner of my mind. I'd see his letter when I reached for my keys, hear his voicemail when I couldn't sleep. I wanted to call him, to tell him about the gallery, the show, the woman I was becoming. But I was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't care. Afraid Claire would be there, her words waiting to cut me again. So I painted instead, pouring my longing into the canvas, letting the women I created carry what I couldn't say. They were my strength, my defiance, my hope. And with every brushstroke, I was rising, not just for myself, but for every woman who'd ever been told she was too much, too little, too old, too anything. The months leading up to the solo show were a whirlwind of color and creation, a dance between exhaustion and exhilaration. My studio was a chaos of canvases, paint tubes squeezed dry, brushes scattered like fallen soldiers. The bookstore job kept me grounded, its quiet rhythm a counterpoint to the intensity of my art. I'd shelve novels and memoirs, my fingers lingering on spines, imagining my own story bound in pages someday. The customers, mostly regulars, started to notice me, not just as the woman behind the counter, but as someone with a spark. You're glowing, an older woman said one day, her eyes kind. I smiled, not deflecting, and said, I'm trying. It was the truth. I was trying, and it was working. Vanessa, the gallery owner, became a mentor, her sharp feedback both daunting and invigorating. She'd visit my studio, her gaze sweeping over my work like a hawk. This one's strong, she'd say, pointing to the woman weaving stars. But push the contrast here, make her shine brighter. Or she'd pause at the woman carving her name into the mountain and say, she's powerful, but let her be vulnerable too. People connect to that. I listened, not because I wanted her approval, but because I trusted her vision. She saw what I was capable of, even when I doubted myself. With every painting, I was learning to trust my own voice, to let it be loud, unapologetic, mine. I painted 12 pieces for the show, each one a facet of the women I'd been, the women I was becoming. There was the star weaver, her hands threading light through darkness. The mountain carver, her chisel steady, her eyes fierce. The storm dancer, her body a blur of joy and defiance. Others joined them, a woman planting seeds in cracked earth, her face soft with hope. A woman holding a mirror, her reflection fractured but whole. A woman singing to the sky, her voice a cascade of colors. Each one felt like a letter to myself, a promise that I wouldn't shrink again. When I finished the last one, a woman standing at a crossroads, her shadow stretching in both directions, I stepped back and cried, not from sadness but from pride. I'd done this. Me. Ruth was there through it all, her red scarf a constant, her faith in me unwavering. She'd bring coffee to the studio, sit on a stool and watch me work, her silence as encouraging as her words. You're not just making art, Eleanor, she said one night, her voice soft. You're making a legacy. The words stopped me, my brush hovering over the canvas. Legacy. I'd never thought of myself that way, as someone who left something behind. I'd spent so long believing my role was to support others, David, Richard, even Claire, that I'd forgotten I could build something for myself. But Ruth was right. These paintings, this show, this life I was carving out, they were my legacy, and I was only beginning. The bookstore became a surprising source of inspiration. I started a small art club there, just a few co-workers and customers who wanted to draw or paint. We'd meet after hours, pushing tables together, sharing cheap wine and cheaper supplies. Mia joined sometimes, her comics adding a playful energy, and Sarah brought her daughter, who'd scribble with crayons while we worked. It wasn't formal like Ruth's classes, but it was ours, a space where we could be messy, honest, free. One night, a coworker named Lena, a shy woman in her 20s, showed us a drawing of a bird breaking out of a cage. This is me, she said, her voice trembling, or who I want to be. I hugged her, feeling the echo of my own journey in hers. I was helping others find their voices, just as Ruth had helped me find mine. Vanessa scheduled the solo show for a Saturday in early spring, the air still crisp but laced with the promise of warmth. The gallery was transformed, my paintings hung with care, each one lit to draw out its depth. I chose a simple black dress for the opening, but I wore a red scarf, a nod to Ruth, a declaration of my own boldness. When I walked in, an hour before the doors opened, I stopped, my breath catching. The space felt alive, my women staring back at me, their stories filling the room. Vanessa hugged me, her eyes bright. This is your moment, Eleanor. Own it. The show was a success beyond anything I'd imagined. People came, hundreds of them, more than the gallery had seen in years, Vanessa said. There were locals, art collectors, even a few critics from nearby cities. They moved through the space, pausing at my paintings, whispering to each other, some wiping tears. A young woman in a leather jacket stood in front of the storm dancer for 10 minutes, her hands clasped like she was praying. An older man bought the seed planter on the spot, saying it reminded him of his mother. A critic from Cleveland wrote notes furiously, her glasses slipping down her nose. I floated through it all, talking to strangers, answering questions, feeling like I was both myself and someone bigger, someone who mattered. Ruth was there, beaming, her arm linked with mine. Mia, Javier, and Sarah came too, their pride a warmth I could feel. Lena from the bookstore showed up, her bird drawing tucked under her arm, a gift for me. I hugged them all, my heart so full it hurt. This was my world now, not just the gallery but the people in it, the connections I'd built, the stories we shared. I didn't need to be invisible anymore. I was here, seen, whole. But there was a moment, just before the speeches, when I felt a familiar ache. I scanned the crowd, searching for David. I hadn't invited him, hadn't called, but a part of me hoped he'd come, that he'd see me in this light, that he'd understand. He wasn't there. The absence stung, but it didn't break me. I'd built this without him, without Claire, without anyone's permission. I didn't need his presence to feel complete, but the longing lingered, a quiet bruise I carried. Vanessa introduced me, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Eleanor Thompson is more than an artist," she said. "She's a voice, a force, a woman who's turned her pain into power." The applause was loud, overwhelming, and I stepped forward, my hands trembling but my voice steady. I spoke about the paintings, about the women they represented, about the journey from silence to song. I didn't mention David or Claire or the album I'd burned, but they were there, woven into every word. "These women are all of us," I said, my eyes sweeping the room. "They're the ones who keep going, who rise, who refuse to be forgotten." The crowd cheered and I felt it. A shift, a claiming, a victory. After the speeches, people swarmed me, asking for my card, my contact, my next show. Vanessa sold 8 paintings that night with 2 more on hold for collectors. A critic asked to interview me for a regional art magazine. A woman from a local college invited me to speak to their art students. I said yes to it all, not because I felt ready, but because I was done saying no. Ruth found me in the chaos, her eyes shining. "You're a star, Eleanor," she said, and I laughed, feeling it for the first time. When the night ended, I stayed late helping Vanessa clean up. The gallery was quiet now, my paintings still on the walls, their presence a comfort. I thought about David, about the letter in my purse, about the boy I'd loved and the man I didn't know. I wanted to call him, to share this with him, but I wasn't ready to open that door, not yet. I was too busy standing in my own light, feeling its warmth, knowing it was mine. I went home and painted, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The canvas was small, intimate, a woman holding a lantern, her face soft, her path unknown. It was me, but it was also every woman who'd ever dared to shine. I painted until the sky turned pink, the world waking around me, and I smiled, knowing I was just getting started. The success of the solo show didn't fade like I thought it might. It wasn't just a moment, it was a door, swinging wide open to a world I'd never dared to imagine. The regional art magazine published the interview, a full-page spread with photos of my paintings and a headline that called me the voice of resilience. I read it at the bookstore, my hands shaking as I turned the pages, half expecting to wake up and find it was a dream. Customers started recognizing me, not just as the woman who shelved their books, but as the artist they'd read about. "You're her, aren't you?" a young woman asked one day, clutching a novel to her chest. "The one who paints those women?" I nodded, my cheeks warm, and she smiled like we shared a secret. "Your work, it makes me feel like I can keep going." I thanked her, my voice catching, and realized this was what Ruth meant by legacy. Not just art, but impact, a ripple that reached beyond me. The college speaking invitation turned into a series of guest lectures at local universities and community centers. I'd stand in front of students, some younger than Mia, others older than me, and talk about my journey. Not just the paintings, but the years of silence, the album I'd burned, the will I'd destroyed. I didn't mention David or Claire by name, but their shadows were there, woven into the story of a woman who'd learned to reclaim herself. The audiences listened, their eyes wide, their questions raw. How do you start over? How do you forgive? How do you stop feeling small? I didn't have all the answers, but I spoke from my truth, and that was enough. After one lecture, a student handed me a sketch she'd done while I spoke. A woman breaking chains, her face fierce. "This is you," she said, and I hugged her, feeling the weight of her trust, the power of her belief. Vanessa kept pushing me forward. She connected me with other galleries, and soon my work was being shown in Cleveland, Columbus, even a small space in Chicago. I sold more paintings, enough to quit the bookstore and focus on art full-time. I rented a proper studio downtown, a loft with high ceilings and windows that let in golden light. It was a far cry from my guest room, but it felt like home, a space where I could breathe, create, be. I hired Lena, the shy bookstore coworker, as my assistant, teaching her to manage orders and shipments. She flourished, her bird drawing now framed on my studio wall, a reminder that we were both breaking free. Ruth's art classes continued, and I started co-teaching with her, leading sessions when she traveled to visit her kids. The students called us a team, joking that Ruth was the fire and I was the flame. Mia, Javier, and Sarah were still there, their work evolving alongside mine. Mia's comics were being published online, Javier's landscapes were selling at local markets, and Sarah was applying to art school, her daughter cheering her on. We celebrated each other's wins, big and small, and I realized this was what family could be, not just blood, but choice, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But David was still a wound, one that hadn't healed. His letter stayed in my purse, joined now by a few more he'd sent, each one shorter, sadder. "Mom, I'm trying," he wrote in the last one. "I know I messed up. Please let me fix it." I read them late at night when the studio was quiet and felt the familiar ache. Love, anger, fear all tangled together. I wanted to call him, to invite him to my studio to show him the woman I'd become. But Claire's words lingered, a barrier I couldn't cross. I didn't trust that David saw me, not really, not yet. So I painted instead, channeling the ache into a new piece. A woman holding a broken chain, her hands scarred but strong, her eyes fixed on something far away. It was my most personal work yet, and I knew it would be the centerpiece of my next show. That show, my second solo exhibition, was set for a larger gallery in Cleveland, a prestigious space that drew critics and collectors from across the Midwest. Vanessa called it my coming out party, a chance to cement my place in the art world. I poured everything into it, creating 15 new pieces, each one bolder, more confident. The woman with the broken chain was joined by others. A woman rebuilding a house from ruins. A woman writing her name in the stars. A woman embracing her shadow. They were my army, my truth, my triumph. When I hung them in the gallery the night before the opening, I felt a surge of power, like I was standing on that cliff from my early painting, ready to fly. The opening night was electric. The gallery was packed, the air humming with voices, clinking glasses, the soft hum of a jazz trio in the corner. My red scarf was a talisman, my black dress a shield. Ruth was there, her pride radiant, and so were Mia, Javier, Sarah, and Lena, their laughter a lifeline. Vanessa introduced me, her voice carrying a weight that made the room hush. "Eleanor Thompson is a force," she said. "Her work doesn't just speak, it demands to be heard." The applause was deafening, and I stepped forward, my heart steady, my voice clear. I spoke about the women in my paintings, about resilience, about refusing to be erased. The crowd hung on every word, and I felt it, their respect, their connection, their love. Then I saw him, David standing near the back, his face pale, his eyes fixed on me. He was alone, no Claire, just him, clutching a program like it was a lifeline. My breath caught, but I didn't falter. I finished my speech, thanked the crowd, and stepped into the sea of people, their hands reaching for mine, their voices a chorus of praise. David didn't approach, but I could feel him watching, waiting. I let him wait. This was my night, my victory, and I wasn't ready to share it. The turning point came later during the final hour. A critic from a national art journal approached me, her notebook open, her questions sharp. "Your work feels deeply personal," she said. "Who are these women to you?" I paused, the crowd fading, David's presence a quiet weight. "They're me," I said, and they're every woman who's been told she's not enough. They're the ones who rise anyway. She nodded, scribbling, and I knew I'd said something true, something that would carry beyond this room. When the critic left, David finally approached. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, I didn't know." He gestured to the paintings, to the woman with the broken chain, tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything." I looked at him, saw the boy I'd loved, the man who'd hurt me, and felt the weight of all we'd lost. The crowd was still there, but it was just us now, standing in the truth. "Why are you here, David?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. He swallowed, his hands trembling. "Because I see you now, and I'm ashamed I didn't before. Claire, she's gone. I ended it. I want to make this right." The words hit me like a storm. Claire, gone. David, here, seeing me. I wanted to believe him, to let him in, but I was still scarred, still guarding the woman I'd fought to become. "I need time," I said, echoing the words I'd told him at the first show. "But thank you for coming." He nodded, tears falling, and stepped back, giving me space. I watched him go, my heart a tangle of hope and caution, and turned back to the crowd, to my paintings, to myself. The night ended with 12 paintings sold, a feature in the National Journal confirmed, and invitations to show in New York and Boston. Vanessa hugged me, whispering, "You're unstoppable." Ruth raised a glass, her eyes shining. My art club surrounded me, their cheers a song. I was soaring, not just for myself, but for every woman who'd ever been dismissed, underestimated, erased. And as I looked at the woman with the broken chain, her scarred hands strong, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. David, forgiveness, or simply more of me. The Cleveland show marked a turning point, not just in my career but in the way I saw myself. The National Journal feature came out a month later, a 4-page spread with glossy photos of my paintings and a headline that read, "Eleanor Thompson, Painting the Unseen." It wasn't just praise, it was recognition, the kind I'd spent my life believing I'd never earn. Galleries called, collectors emailed, universities invited me to speak. I was no longer the receptionist, the ex-wife, the mother who'd burned her past. I was Eleanor, the artist, the storyteller, the woman who'd risen from ashes. But even as I stood in that light, David's words from the show lingered, a quiet current pulling at me. "I see you now," he'd said, and I wanted to believe him, but trust was a fragile thing, and I wasn't sure I could rebuild it yet. I threw myself into my work, letting it anchor me. My new studio became a sanctuary, its high ceilings and wide windows a canvas for my dreams. Lena, my assistant, kept things organized, her quiet efficiency a comfort. She'd started painting too, her birds now soaring across canvases, and I mentored her, passing on what Ruth had given me. Ruth herself was a constant, her red scarf a beacon during our co-teaching sessions at the library. "You're not just an artist anymore," she said one evening, her eyes crinkling. "You're a movement." I laughed, but her words stayed with me, a reminder that my story wasn't just mine. It was every woman's, every person who'd been told they didn't matter. I started a scholarship fund with some of the money from my sales, a small program for women over 40 who wanted to pursue art but couldn't afford it. I named it after my mother, Marie, not because she'd been an artist, but because she'd never had the chance to be. The first recipient was a woman named Carla, a 52-year-old nurse who'd always wanted to sculpt. When I handed her the award at a small ceremony, she cried, clutching my hands. "You've given me a dream," she said, and I cried too, feeling my mother's presence, her quiet sacrifices finally honored. The scholarship was my way of planting seeds, of ensuring no one else had to wait as long as I did to be seen. My lectures grew into keynote speeches, not just at colleges but at women's conferences and art festivals. I spoke in Chicago, Atlanta, even a small but packed event in London. I told my story, raw, unfiltered, unflinching. I talked about the girl who'd torn up her painting, the wife who'd stopped dreaming, the mother who'd burned her album and her will. I talked about Claire's words, about David's silence, about the fire that had saved me. Audiences stood, clapped, wept. Women came up afterward, their stories spilling out. A lost job, an abusive marriage, a family that didn't see them. I listened, hugged them, gave them my card. "You are enough," I'd say, and they'd nod, eyes shining as if hearing it from me made it true. But David was still there, a question I couldn't answer. He'd started writing again, not letters but emails, each one careful, deliberate. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he wrote after the journal feature. "I read the article. I had no idea how much you'd been through." Another time, he sent a photo of himself at the beach where we'd gone when he was 6, the one from the album I'd burned. "I miss this," he wrote. "I miss us." I read them in my studio, the woman with the broken chain watching me from her canvas, and felt the pull of love and pain. Claire was gone, he'd said, but that didn't erase the years of distance, the silence when I'd needed him. I wanted to forgive, but forgiveness felt like letting go of the anger that had fueled me, and I wasn't sure I could do that yet. One day, I got an invitation to speak at a major art conference in New York, a keynote address to thousands. It was the biggest stage I'd ever been offered, and I said yes without hesitation. Vanessa helped me prepare, curating a small exhibit of my work to accompany the speech. Ruth flew in, her red scarf brighter than ever, and Lena came too, her confidence growing with every trip. The night before the conference, I stood in the empty exhibit hall, my paintings hung under soft lights, and felt a quiet awe. The woman weaving stars, the woman carving her name, the woman with the broken chain, they were here, in this city, in this moment, because of me. The keynote was a blur of nerves and power. I wore my red scarf, my voice steady as I told my story to a sea of faces. I spoke about the women in my paintings, about the ones in the audience, about the ones who'd never been given a chance. "Your worth does not depend on someone else's validation," I said, my voice rising. "You are enough not because someone says so, but because you are." The applause was a roar, and I stood there, tears in my eyes, feeling every woman I'd ever been, the girl, the wife, the mother, the artist, all of them whole, all of them mine. David was there. I didn't see him until after, when the crowd had thinned, and he approached, his face older, softer, his eyes red. "Mom," he said, and I stopped, my heart pounding. I had to come. You were incredible." He paused, his hands shaking. "I've been reading everything about you. The shows, the scholarship, the speeches. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, that I didn't see you." His voice broke, and I saw it. The boy from the beach, the man who was trying, the son who was hurting too. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I want to be in your life, if you'll let me." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the weight he carried. Guilt, love, hope. I thought about the album, the will, the years I'd spent believing I had to earn his love. I thought about Claire's words, about the fire that had burned away my silence, and I thought about the woman I was now, the one who didn't need his validation but wanted his presence, not as a savior, but as a son. "I don't know if I can forgive yet," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I'm willing to try. Let's start slow." He nodded, tears falling, and we stood there, not hugging, not yet, but close enough to feel the possibility. The conference ended with my painting sold out, a commission for a mural in a women's shelter, and a book deal offer from a publisher who'd heard my speech. I flew home with Ruth and Lena, my heart full, my future wide. I kept painting, kept speaking, kept building the scholarship. David and I started talking, small steps, coffee dates, quiet conversations about the past. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was enough. One night in my studio, I painted a final piece, a woman holding a lantern, its light soft but steady, illuminating a path that stretched beyond the canvas. I hung it in my home, not for sale, but for me. It was my symbol, my reminder, my truth. I was enough, not because of David or Ruth or the world, but because I'd chosen to be. I'd burned the album, the will, the parts of me that believed otherwise, and in their ashes, I'd built a life, a legacy, a light that would never go out.